Disney fireworks were still cracking outside when my son whispered, "They're planning to corner you tomorrow, call you a burden if you don't sign." I'm Graham Alcott, 52, an internal auditor sitting in a resort suite that smells faintly of chlorine. My father's old leather suitcase resting by my feet, still unscarred. Ever had a trip turn into a test you didn't see coming? It was the kind of cold that seemed to crawl through the seams of your coat and settle in your bones, the Detroit winter air creeping in every time the automatic doors sighed open. I stood in line at Detroit Metro ticket in hand, the familiar hum of departure boards overhead. When the agent scanned my boarding pass, her polite frown said everything before her words did. "It seems your seat's been adjusted, Mr. Alcott. You're in 28C now, coach." She handed the flimsy paper slip back to me as if she were giving condolences, her voice soft but brisk. Behind me, Rowan's laugh carried light and cutting. My old brown leather suitcase leaned against my leg. The edges were worn smooth from decades of use, the kind of scuffs that told stories of long drives, motel carpets, and more airports than I cared to count. Rowan reached down with 2 fingers, lifted the handle as if it were something rescued from a flea market. Still hauling this relic around, surprised it hasn't turned to dust. She dropped at the handle, thudding against the tile, and offered a thin smile before gliding back to her designer tote. I didn't answer. The smell of burnt espresso wafted over from the Concourse Cafe, bitter and comforting all at once, a reminder to keep my mouth shut and my ears open. Corinne stood a few feet ahead, perfectly polished as always, her posture so straight it looked rehearsed. I caught the way she leaned toward Rowan, voice low but clear enough to thread through the airport's murmur. "We'll get Graham to sign over the retirement account while we're in Florida. Easier to do it when he's in a good mood after the family dinner." My name on her lips like a formality. Something administrative rather than personal. The words settled in my gut heavier than the cold. Miles, walking beside me, shot me a glance from the corner of his eye, but said nothing. He didn't need to. I could read the unease in the way his jaw tightened. We shuffled forward in the snaking line, the dull voice of the intercom announcing another delayed departure. And my mind ticked through the moments that had led to this. 20 years of going along, nodding through family plans, writing checks that kept everything running. 20 years of telling myself I didn't mind the quiet seat at the edge of the table as long as the family stayed whole. And now here I was holding a ticket that put me squarely at the back of the plane, my contributions forgotten, except for the balance they wanted to drain. Rowan let her voice rise just enough to cut through the din. "Once his signs were set," she said like she was discussing an overdue errand, not a man's future. Her smirk lingered as she brushed a strand of perfectly straight hair behind her ear. I wrapped my fingers around the handle of my suitcase until my knuckles whitened the leather warm from my grip, the only thing grounding me in that buzzing terminal. My first instinct was to call them out, make a scene right there between the magazine stand and the gate agent's podium. But years of biting my tongue had taught me something. Sometimes the only power left is patience. Corinne adjusted the strap of her bag, pulling a sleek leather folder from beneath her coat. She didn't notice when I slowed my pace behind her, didn't hear the faint click as I raised my phone and snapped a photo of the gold embossed label, Retirement Authorization, Draft. She was already walking ahead, weaving through the crowd, with her sister, heads bent close together like co-conspirators rehearsing lines. I slid my phone back into my pocket and felt the weight of the image settle like a pebble in my palm. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was proof that I wasn't imagining things, that I wasn't just the bitter husband with a tattered suitcase and a downgraded ticket. The gate agent's voice chimed over the speakers calling our group. Cold air swept in again from the doors as another traveler entered the concourse, and I pulled my coat tighter, my suitcase rolling beside me. Every wheel turn clicked softly against the tile, a quiet rhythm that steadied my thoughts. I kept my face neutral, my steps even as my mind began to map out the trip ahead. Florida was supposed to be a family vacation, a sunlit escape from the Midwest chill. But now I knew better. It wasn't an escape, it was a stage. And if they thought I was just going to play my assigned role, they hadn't been paying attention to the quiet man with the scuffed suitcase, who for once was listening more than he spoke. By the time we reached the gate, Corinne and Rowan were already laughing about something trivial, oblivious to the photo stored on my phone and the way I was cataloging every move, every whisper. Miles gave me a brief searching look, but I only nodded, keeping my calm veneer. As we handed over our boarding passes, I glanced once more at that folder under Corinne's arm. My thumb hovered over the edge of my phone in my pocket, reassured by the captured image. They thought they were setting the agenda for Florida. They had no idea I'd already started writing my own. The gate lounge had that stale, processed air that only big airports seem to cultivate, a mix of industrial disinfectant and the lingering scent of burgers from a nearby chain restaurant. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a flat glow over rows of plastic chairs. Overhead, the flight status screens flickered every few seconds, a jittery reminder that the world moved on even when you were sitting perfectly still. My boarding group predictably was called last, which meant another stretch of waiting, while Corinne and Rowan drifted ahead, laughing softly, like the winners of some invisible game. I sat in one of those molded chairs, my old suitcase parked by my feet, like a loyal, battered companion, and let 20 years spool out in my head. It's amazing how clearly you can see the shape of a life when you're forced to sit still. I thought about the backyard barbecues, those humid Michigan summers when the smoke from the grill mingled with the sweet tang of store-bought barbecue sauce. Rowan would sit in a lounge chair, sunglasses perched like a crown, while I handled the HOA dues for the family property, quietly writing checks to keep the pool open and the lawns trimmed, all while the others talked about vacations and new cars. It didn't bother me then, not as much as it should have. I told myself I was keeping the gears turning, that my job was to be the steady hand, the man who made sure the lights stayed on and the bills got paid. I closed my eyes for a moment, and in that dim space between the boarding announcements, I could hear my father's voice. He was there, in memory, his calloused hands resting on that same brown suitcase when he passed it down to me years ago in our small garage. "Your backbone," he'd said, his voice a steady hum over the rain outside, "isn't your job or your bank account. It's your principles. Don't ever let someone buy those out from under you." The suitcase had smelled faintly of cedar back then, a hint of the shelves it sat on for years, waiting for its next journey. That scent was long gone, but the weight of his words hadn't faded a bit. Beside me, Miles shifted in his chair, his sneakers scuffing against the tile. He leaned closer, his voice low, the way people talk when they don't want to startle a fragile animal. "Dad, they don't see you as family," he murmured, eyes fixed on Corinne and Rowan as they hovered near the gate agent. Just as a wallet, there wasn't any venom in his tone, just a quiet clarity that cut sharper than anger ever could. I felt something inside me tighten, not in fear, but in recognition. He was right, and I'd been willfully ignoring it for too long. The intercom crackled with another update for some delayed flight to Dallas, and my gaze drifted back to Rowan. She was pulling that sleek leather tote up onto her shoulder, her hand dipping inside for just a moment. When she tilted it toward her, I caught a glimpse of a folder, the corner of its tab, just visible, transfer of retirement holdings. It wasn't even subtle. She glanced around, a quick dart of her eyes, then tucked it deeper and zipped the tote with a practiced flick. The sight wasn't shocking, not after what I'd overheard earlier, but it settled like a stone in my chest all the same. I leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, feeling the hard plastic press between my shoulder blades, and looked down at the suitcase by my feet. The leather was faded, the handle softened by years of my grip. It had been through moves, funerals, business trips, and more sleepless red-eyes than I could count. My father's words echoed again, low and steady, almost drowned out by the chatter of boarding calls and suitcase wheels rattling across the tile. Principles, not signatures, not appeasement principles. The boarding chime rang out, our group finally called. Corinne and Rowan were already gliding toward the jet bridge, oblivious to anything but their own schedule. Miles rose beside me, his eyes asking a question he didn't need to voice. I stayed seated for another beat, staring at the suitcase, tracing the worn seam along its edge with my thumb. I wasn't going to be blindsided this time. Not by a folder, not by a signature slipped in between pleasantries, not by 20 more years of quiet acquiescence. I stood, the suitcase handle cool and familiar in my hand, and joined the slow-moving line toward the gate. My face stayed neutral, my steps even, but inside something had shifted. I wasn't just along for their trip anymore. Whatever they had planned in Florida, I'd be ready. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was carrying more than just an old suitcase. I was carrying a decision, one that was entirely mine to make. The diner had smelled like every bad decision I'd ever made at 2 a.m, burnt coffee bacon grease, heavy in the air, and the faint tang of cleaning supplies that never quite masked the stale fry oil. A flickering neon sign out front buzzed like an angry hornet, its red glow cutting through the drizzle on the I-75 shoulder. I remember sliding into that cracked vinyl booth across from Silas Merritt, the only man I trusted enough to show my doubts to. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, watching the swirl of cream as if it might spell something out. "You're being groomed for a trap, Graham." He'd set his tone so even it almost felt casual. Then he reached into his worn leather satchel and slid a single-page invoice across the table. The thing looked like a crime scene whiteout streaks, a shaky signature that wasn't mine. A stamp I didn't recognize. HOA reimbursements billed in my name. Padding accounts I had never even seen. The ink smudged slightly under my thumb as I picked it up. "This is how they work," Silas said. "Slow leaks. By the time you notice, you're ankle deep in water and they've built the raft without you." The diner's fluorescent lights flickered, one bulb buzzing overhead. I sat back, letting the vinyl groan beneath me, and asked, "So what do I do, divorce lawyers, investigators?" Silas shook his head, a slow, deliberate move. "Not yet. If they're planning a big move, they'll need you to sign something to make it airtight. That's when you have leverage. Make them sign first, no matter what. Every paper trail tells a story. Make sure yours can't be rewritten." His calmness wasn't reassuring, not exactly, but it was steady, and that was enough to anchor me in that greasy little booth. Now, as the rental shuttle eased toward Orlando International, that meeting replayed in my head like a warning bell. The Florida air was a wall of humidity, thick enough to make every breath feel weighted. I stepped into the airport cafe with Miles trailing behind, the hiss of the espresso machine blending with the chatter of families fresh off their flights. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering for a second before I sent Silas the photo I'd snapped in Detroit retirement authorization, draft Corinne's folder, glinting like a warning flare. The photo felt heavier than the phone itself as I slid it back into my pocket. The barista called my name, setting a paper cup on the counter with my order scrawled across it in green marker. The steam curled up into the thick Florida air, carrying the bitter, almost metallic scent of strong espresso. I wrapped my hands around the cup, more for grounding than warmth, and felt the vibration a moment later, Silas's reply, lighting up my screen. "Stay quiet. Trust me, the trap can spring both ways." Miles was watching me, his brow furrowed just slightly, like he was piecing together a puzzle but didn't want to ask out loud. "Everything okay?" he said, voice low. I gave a small nod, more to reassure him than to answer truthfully. Through the wide glass of the cafe, I could see Corinne and Rowan at the baggage carousel, laughing over something as their glossy luggage circled the belt. Their laughter carried through the glass, tinny and distant, like a song playing on a station you didn't ask for. I reached into my carry-on and pulled out the folder Silas had given me last year, its edges still smudged with fingerprints and ink stains from our diner meeting. I tucked it deep into my suitcase, the zipper's rasp loud in the quiet pause between announcements. The old leather creaked softly as I closed it, the sound oddly satisfying, like sealing a vault. Outside, Corinne gestured broadly with one hand, as Rowan nodded along the two of them, oblivious to the weight I'd just locked away. I rested my hand on the suitcase handle, feeling the familiar worn groove where my fingers always settled. I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. But as I watched them laugh and planned for whatever game they thought they were running, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't just along for the ride anymore. The suitcase wasn't just baggage, it was a vault, and inside I had everything I needed to turn their trap into their undoing. The resort suite was awash in warm light, the kind that softened the edges of everything but couldn't quite reach the corners where the shadows sat. Beyond the glass doors, the faint, sharp scent of chlorine drifted up from the pool deck, mingling with the humid Florida night air. Every few seconds, a burst of Disney fireworks painted the room in brief flashes of red and gold shadows, stretching and snapping back with each explosion. Miles stood near the balcony, arm crossed, eyes shifting toward the adjoining suite. His voice, low and tight, broke the hum of the air conditioner. "Dad," he whispered, leaning closer as another volley of fireworks cracked the sky. Mom and Rowan plan to corner you tomorrow. They said if you don't sign, they'll call you a burden. Make it sound like you're dead weight. His words weren't meant to shock, just to confirm what I'd already begun to suspect. Hearing them spoken out loud still hit like a nail driven into wood, final unbending. On the table, my tablet buzzed with a new email. The subject line glowed in the dim lamplight: family signing session, 10:00 a.m. Attendees Graham, Corinne, Rowan, legal. The glow lit the edges of my hand as I picked it up, the faint reflection of my clenched jaw visible in the darkened screen. I tapped the screen to life, screenshotting the email, and saved it without a word. Miles watched as I slid my shoes back on and left for the lobby printer, the quiet swish of the door behind me nearly drowned by the muted chatter from the hallway. Downstairs, the resort lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and distant coffee brewing for the late-night staff. The printer spat out the email with a mechanical whir. The ink still warmed to the touch as I folded the paper neatly into thirds. The paper felt heavier than it should have as I slid it into a folder and carried it back upstairs. Each step of the carpeted hall muffled beneath my shoes. Corinne's laughter filtered faintly through the closed door of the adjoining suite as I re-entered, her voice clipped and cool. Rowan softer, but carrying that same sharp edge of confidence. They weren't worried. Not yet. Inside our suite, I opened my suitcase and placed the printed email inside, tucking it between Silas's old notes and a copy of the doctored invoices. The leather creaked as I zipped it shut, a sound that felt final in its own quiet way. I set the suitcase by the window where the fireworks light flashed over its scuffed surface, casting momentary highlights on its worn handle. I sat beside it, fingers drumming against the handle in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each tap syncing with the distant booms outside. Miles lingered near the doorway, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. "What are you going to do?" he asked, voice hushed but steady. I didn't look up at him right away. Another burst of fireworks sent shadows crawling across the floor, tracing lines between us like fractures in the light. "If tomorrow they want my signature," I said finally, my voice as calm as I could make it, "they'll have to give me theirs first." He nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, though his eyes still flickered with worry. Outside, the fireworks began to fade, replaced by the low drone of crickets and the occasional distant cheer from the pool bar. I reached over, locked the suitcase with a soft click, and leaned it against the wall beside the window. The faint reflection of the fireworks shimmered on its surface, the old leather catching what little glow the night offered. "Tomorrow," I said quietly, glancing over at Miles. We stopped being the audience. The boy nodded again, more firmly this time, and pulled the curtains closed. The final pop of a firework echoed from somewhere beyond the glass, a sharp reminder that the night was ending. In the silence that followed, the room seemed to settle, every sound from the hallway and pool below fading into the background. All that remained was the steady hum of the air conditioner and the weight of the plan sealed and waiting by the window in the scuffed brown suitcase. The boardroom felt like a stage dressed to soothe nerves it never intended to soothe. Mahogany panels lined the walls, polished to a shine that caught the overhead light and threw back a muted glow. The air smelled faintly of citrus polish, layered over something more human. An expensive cologne that hung in the corners, faint, but pointed, the kind worn by men who signed papers for a living. The soft hum of the air system was the only steady sound, until Corinne's nails began their impatient staccato against the folder she held. She and Rowan sat opposite me with a lawyer between them, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting each time he glanced up. He had the detached expression of someone who'd seen this play out 100 times, ready to jot notes, but keeping his emotions somewhere else entirely. Rowan twirled a sleek metallic pen between her fingers, the click echoing louder than it should have in the still room. Her smirk was practiced, casual enough to pretend she wasn't enjoying herself, but not casual enough to hide the little thrill in her eyes. Corinne's smile, tight and deliberate, never quite reached hers. They slid the documents toward me, the paper whispering as it moved over the polished wood. The sound was slick, deliberate, like a blade drawn across silk. Corinne's voice, even and soft, carried the weight of a command. "We've already taken care of our parts, Graham. This is the last piece we need." She nodded toward the page, tapping the pen once against the signature line before sliding it across to me. In that quiet moment, Silas's words surfaced like a buoy in deep water. Make them sign first. Paper trails don't lie. My eyes skimmed the top page signatures in neat looping strokes, dates inked just hours ago. Their commitments already recorded. I could almost hear Silas's wry chuckle in my head, telling me that leverage was rarely loud. It was ink on paper already drying. The lawyer cleared his throat gently. "Your turn, Mr. Alcott," he murmured, sliding the pen a little closer. Miles shifted in his seat beside me, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the tile. I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. I let my hand hover over the pen, my fingers brushing the cool barrel. I drew in a slow breath, eyes drifting over the fine print, not because I hadn't read it before, but because I wanted them to feel the pause. The words blurred slightly, the tension in the room tightening with each passing second. My hand trembled just enough for the movement to register. Corinne's nails stopped tapping. Rowan's smirk faltered for a beat. Then I closed the folder with deliberate care, the soft thud of the cover snapping shut, breaking the tension like a single drumbeat. I slid it across the table away from me and opened my suitcase with a steady motion. The zipper's rasp cut through the silence as I tucked the folder inside its weight, sinking into the worn leather like a secret being swallowed whole. "I'll need a day," I said evenly, my voice carrying just enough finality to make it clear this wasn't up for debate. The lawyer blinked, adjusting his glasses, his pen hovering over his notepad, as if waiting for a cue. Rowan muttered something sharp under her breath, a curse that sounded louder in the stillness. Corinne's mask cracked for the first time, her words losing their silk. "Graham, don't make this harder than it has to be," she said, the faint edge of desperation creeping into her tone. I closed the suitcase and rested my hand on the handle, feeling the familiar grooves in the leather beneath my fingers. The air hummed the citrus scent lingering as the silence stretched, and I met Corinne's eyes without speaking. Outside the boardroom's heavy door, the muffled sounds of resort life, distant laughter, the clink of glasses seeped in, a reminder that the world moved on whether or not this little theater reached its conclusion. I stood slowly, the suitcase rolling upright beside me, and waited just long enough for the tension to hang heavy before turning toward the door. The scene wasn't over yet, but for the first time all trip, I felt the weight of the next move sitting firmly in my hands. The resort lobby was still half asleep when I rolled my suitcase across its polished marble floor, the sound of the wheels echoing softly in the open space. Outside the tall glass windows, the first edge of sunlight slipped over the horizon, spilling pale gold across the tile. The air smelled faintly of chlorine from the pool beyond the courtyard, and the comforting bitterness of coffee brewing somewhere behind the front desk for the early staff. The soft scrape of a mop bucket and the distant footsteps of cleaning crews were the only other sounds, each one muted by the vast, high-ceilinged quiet. Halfway to the door, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp vibration that cut through the stillness. I pulled it out, the glow of the screen lighting my hand in the dim lobby. Silas's text was brief, practical, but heavy with finality: funds transferred. "They can't touch it now." I opened the banking app, the confirmation email bright against the pre-dawn gloom. The numbers were there, intact and secure, safe from whatever plans Corinne and Rowan had been hatching behind their polished smiles and careful words. I let out a long, measured breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The phone buzzed again this time, flashing Corinne's name across the screen. I let it ring. The call ended, then started again almost immediately. Her voice spilled into my voicemail in clipped, escalating tones, first coaxing, then sharp, and finally, as I stood by the revolving door, shrill with frustration. I didn't need to hear the specifics to know the pattern. A muffled shout from Rowan carried in the background of one of the messages, distant but unmistakable, her voice slicing through like static. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stepped out into the morning air. The world outside was still damp from the night, the smell of dew on warm pavement mixing with the faint diesel scent of arriving shuttles. The quiet was a strange comfort. For once there were no instructions, no demands, just the rhythmic thrum of my suitcase wheels over the concrete as I moved toward the curb. The weight of the old leather handle was steady in my grip, familiar but lighter now, as though it carried something other than just clothes and papers. Miles appeared from the side entrance, his stride quick but measured a backpack slung over one shoulder. His face was drawn but calm. A faint flicker of relief breaking through the tension around his eyes. Without a word, he stepped beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder as the waiting car pulled up the driver, stepping out to stow our bags. For a moment, we just stood there, watching the sunlight creep higher over the resort's manicured hedges and stucco walls. "Dad," Miles said softly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You finally chose yourself." There wasn't any judgment in his tone, just a quiet kind of pride, the sort that comes when someone you love finally steps out from a shadow you didn't even realize they'd been standing in. I looked at him, then back at the suitcase in my hand, its scuffed surface catching the soft morning light, and nodded once. As we slid into the back seat, my phone rang again. A different tone this time, the family lawyer's number flashing across the display. I stared at it for a moment, the vibration buzzing against my palm, then let it continue. The driver closed the trunk with a hollow thud, and the faint sound of distant shouting from the resort doors was swallowed as the car door shut. I tucked the phone into my jacket pocket and leaned back against the seat. The car eased forwards, the lobby receding in the rear window as the Palm Line Drive curved away from the resort. The shouting faded to nothing, replaced by the hum of tires over asphalt and the quiet, steady sound of my own breathing. For the first time in a long while, I felt no pull to turn back, no compulsion to explain or defend. The old suitcase rested by my legs, solid and steady, and for once I felt like it carried freedom instead of baggage. The office still smelled of fresh paint, sharp and clean, mixing with the richer aroma of coffee brewing in the corner. It was small by any standard 2 rooms. Creaking floorboards, a draft that slipped under the windows when the Michigan wind picked up, but it felt more like mine than any house or boardroom I'd ever stood in. Miles was on a step stool by the front window, hanging the laminated sign we'd picked up the day before. The letters were bold and simple: financial foundations for retirees. The sunlight cut through the glass, catching the edges of the sign so it glowed faintly against the pale gray walls. Silas leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression the same calm blend of wry amusement and quiet pride he'd had since the day at that diner. "Funny," he said softly, his voice low enough to almost get lost under the hum of the radiator, "how they called you deadweight. Now you're helping people stay afloat." His words weren't sharp, just a gentle reminder, and I let them settle without answering. There was no gloating in them, only perspective. I sat at the old oak desk we'd salvaged from a thrift shop, the surface still carrying faint scratches from its last life. Stacks of community flyers were spread across it, the fresh ink smell still clinging to the pages. As I signed the last registration form for our first group session, I reached for the chipped ceramic coffee cup resting by the blotter. A thin line of golden tape ran down one side, where the cup had cracked years ago, the repair catching the afternoon light in a subtle gleam. I turned it in my hand for a moment, watching the way the gold glinted before taking a slow sip. The coffee had cooled, but the taste was steady grounding. Miles hopped down from the stool, brushing dust off his hands. He lingered by the edge of the desk, his gaze drifting toward the open window that looked out onto the quiet Detroit street below. "Do you think Mom will ever come around?" he asked, his voice cautious, almost testing the air. The question hung there, filling the room with a weight that even the hum of the radiator couldn't mask. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say, not now, maybe not ever. The silence was its own kind of answer, and Miles seemed to understand, his shoulders easing as he looked back at the sign, swaying gently in the window. Silas pushed off the doorway, his shoes making a soft sound against the wood as he crossed the room. "Whether she does or not," he said, his tone even, "you've already rebuilt more than she ever could." The words were matter of fact, not meant to wound, but they carried a truth I felt in my chest as much as I heard. I looked down at the golden seam on my coffee cup again and let a faint smile touch the corner of my mouth. The sun dipped lower, throwing longer shadows across the floor, and we began to pack up. Miles shut off the coffee machine, Silas gathered the stack of flyers into neat piles, and I pulled my suitcase from under the desk. The old brown leather was as worn as ever, but the new sticker on its side, white letters on a deep blue background, read, "My Own Path." It was still my father's suitcase, still carried the weight of years. but now it felt different, not like baggage, but like a companion for whatever came next. I flipped the lock on the front door, the click echoing softly in the quiet hallway, and glanced back once at the sign glowing faintly in the window. The radiator's hum faded as we stepped into the cold evening, and I pulled the suitcase alongside me. The sound of its wheels on the worn wood floor was steady, measured as we left the office behind for the night. The work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was truly my work built. Not for someone else's comfort, but for something that might actually last. The morning light stretched long across the surface of my desk, turning the scattered papers into pale sheets of gold and making the ink on my notes shimmer faintly. Right in the center of it all sat a single envelope, cream-colored its flap, sealed with a careful press my name written in Corinne's looping hand. It looked out of place among the workshop flyers, invoices, and sign-up lists, a relic from a life I'd stepped away from. My suitcase leaned near the coat rack, the sticker on its side. My own path catching the same sunlight, a small flash of white against the worn brown leather. The smell of coffee drifted up from the mug by my hand, rising with the faint steam curling into the cool air of a Detroit spring morning. The sound of muffled chatter and clinking cups came from the bakery on the floor below, an easy hum that filled the silence without asking for anything in return. I ran a finger along the edge of the envelope, feeling the texture of the paper soft and almost hesitant. My eyes flicked toward the coffee cup beside me, the same one I'd mended last year. Its hairline crack sealed with a thin strip of golden tape that glimmered softly whenever the light shifted. I took a slow sip, letting the taste settle as I stared at the envelope. I knew what was inside before I opened it. An apology, a request, maybe a plea. Corinne's handwriting alone told the story too deliberate, every loop and curve carefully measured, as though neat letters could smooth over the jagged pieces left behind. I didn't move to break the seal. Instead, my gaze wandered to the wall where the workshop schedule hung a neat calendar filled with names and phone numbers. Reminders of the people already walking through the door each week. Retirees with questions, couples trying to untangle years of financial knots. Widowers looking for someone to tell them they hadn't been left behind completely. Lives changing in small but steady ways. The office door creaked open and Miles poked his head in a crooked smile on his face. "Coffee's good today," he said, holding up his own cup from downstairs. They finally fixed that grinder. He looked at the envelope but didn't comment, just stepped inside and leaned against the desk. For a minute, we talked about nothing. Our next session, a broken radiator at home, the Tigers' rough start to the season. His laugh, brief and easy, filled the space like a kind of balm before he excused himself, leaving me alone with the letter once again. I picked up a pen from the desk, turning it in my fingers, tapping it lightly against my thumb as I stared at Corinne's careful script. I imagined her voice in the words softer, now contrite, maybe even genuine. The pen hovered over a blank sheet of paper, the tip a whisper away from writing something back. But my hand didn't move. I set the pen down with a soft click, the sound small but final in the stillness. "Some bridges can wait," I murmured, the words barely louder than the distant traffic outside. "And some don't need rebuilding." It wasn't bitterness, just a statement, a truth I'd finally made peace with. Crossing the room, I pushed open the office window. A crisp breeze swept in, immediately stirring the papers on my desk and carrying with it the scent of blooming trees and the faint warmth of sunlight on brick. The air felt new, unclaimed, a small invitation from the season itself. The suitcase by the wall caught the light again, the sticker shining brighter as the sun shifted, not as a beacon to leave, but as a reminder of the road already traveled. I stood there for a moment, letting the spring air fill the room, and closed my eyes against the glow. The letter stayed unopened, the coffee cup still warm in my hand, the hum of the street below a steady rhythm to anchor the quiet. For the first time in years, there was no decision pressing down on me, no signature waiting like a weight. Just the calm and the space to decide when or if I'd ever pick up that pen. The morning breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the faint aroma of coffee and fresh bread, while the golden seam on my old cup caught the light like a quiet reminder that some things can be mended. I thought about how justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through steady choices and the courage to walk away. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. For anyone feeling cast aside by work, by family, by loss, there's still room to find new roads, even if you build them one quiet step at a time. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share your story or reflections below. I'd love to hear them.